Jessica Chen, presenting on Asian American and racial identity in mental health.
Hi everyone, my name's Jessica Chen, and I did my capstone research project on Asian American racial identity and mental health. And before I even begin, I want to give a disclaimer that this topic talks about things that are clearly huge topics to talk about, like race, culture, mental health. These are topics that can be hard to talk about, and they can be really personal experiences. So who I am, I'm Asian American, I've had my own mental health struggles. Who I am is just my imperfect lens to viewing these universal human experiences. And I know I don't speak for everyone, but I hope everyone here can relate to at least one thing I say today. So I want to begin with the story of someone named Luke Tang. He was a sophomore at Harvard when he died by suicide, and it shocked his family, his community, his friends. And what happened afterwards was that a group of people came together and they talked to his family, and they produced a documentary called Looking for Luke. And it was sort of on the experiences of his friends and his family and the whole community really coming together to understand what happened to Luke. And I ended up talking to Dr. Juliana Chen, and she was an executive producer of the film. And she shared sort of some of her own experiences. And one experience was her training experience, where she mentioned how she would rarely see Asian kids, and if she did see them, it would frequently be after crises. They'd just been admitted to treatment because their depression was so bad they weren't functioning, or because they were feeling suicidal or had a suicidal attempt. And I think this experience of hers relates directly to Luke and relates directly to a more systemic problem in which, when it comes to mental health, sometimes the issues are only recognized when it's something as extreme as suicide. And moreover, a lot of the times the support doesn't reach people until it's really too late. And that was the case for Luke, and that's been the case for a lot of students. So my project ended up breaking down this importance of racial identity and mental health at an individual, community, and professional level. And I specifically talked about Asian Americans because I'm Asian American myself, and that's the experience that I can relate to. But essentially, when I first started, I was reading a lot of research and a lot of articles, and it was a lot of expertise that I honestly didn't have any personal expertise on. I really could just speak from my own experiences, but what ended up happening was when I started going out and talking to people. I talked to teachers at this school, like Ms. Leong and Ms. Liu, who are in the audience today, but I also talked to a lot of students, and they had a ton of insights that I really appreciated. And sorry, there's one slide that wasn't there. And they gave me a lot of insights that kind of encouraged me and drove me, and it ended up being the core part of my research. And that was one takeaway I kind of had, and that was that I didn't need to outsource my expertise. I could rely on my own community and the own insights that I could personally gain from talking to people who are near me in the Newton North community. And then afterwards, I branched out to more initiatives around Boston and some professionals. But in the end, some of my favorite conversations were with students and teachers and counselors. So this is one student that I interviewed. His name is Sheil, and he graduated in the class of 2018. He described his experience of a huge culture of independence because of the stereotype to do anything, the model minority stereotype. He said, "I think we're expected to be all right all the time. I think you kind of put that on yourself. You kind of internalize that I should be okay." And I think his experience echoed a lot of what I heard, and it also brought up a topic that a lot of people mentioned, and it was this model minority myth. And what this is, for people who don't know, is this idea that Asian kids are really smart, they're academically successful, and they're more successful than their peers. And when this manifests in mental health in a school setting, when Asian American kids might need support, how does this perception of them affect who reaches out to them? And a statistic was that Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek mental health services than other Americans. And I think this highlights 2 aspects of the problem. One aspect is that adults may be reaching out to Asian American students less because from an academic perspective, they don't need support. And then on the other side was that it was sometimes an internalized perception that I should be okay, why would I need these services? and reaching out can lead to feelings of guilt and shame. So another piece to the story is the community level, and I ended up talking to a researcher from BU, AWARE, and this is a program specifically for Asian Americans in mental health, and she shared her experience where she saw that Asian American children and Asian American parents had huge communication problems and huge conflicts. And I think this problem related to something that was this huge generational and cultural gap that sometimes can exist between Asian American kids and their parents. And I'm a first or second generation, depending on you define it, person, and my parents actually immigrated from China. But how this manifests is that sometimes Asian American kids and their parents might have grown up in sort of like a distant system and a different culture. And as you see in this graphic here, this is just to illustrate like some differences between Western and Eastern cultures. This is just sometimes how you deal with problems. And when you're talking with your parents and you need to talk through problems, what sort of miscommunication and conflict might arise from just those cultural differences and those different experiences. So there ends up being sometimes a really huge cultural and generational gap when it comes to Asian American families and then the mental health resources we can offer in America. And part of it is the culture, and part of it is just, in the end, with all those miscommunications and conflicts, what gets painted as a problem. And this is Emily Jang. She's a student at Lexington High School, and she described sort of how sometimes she really sees the Asian American community getting thrown under the bus. And what she meant by this was there's an easy narrative to tell where Asian parents are really strict with their kids. They're not that emotionally expressive, and they're not sympathetic, and this leads to mental health problems. But I think this association can be really harmful when, through the miscommunication and the problem, one person is painted as bad, and it's not a dialogue of how you can come together and really connect and communicate. So one really important piece to this was this idea of language. And Dr. Juliana Chen once said to me, she said, there are some languages where there isn't even a word for depression. And what can this mean when you need to talk about mental health with your parents, and they might be from a different culture, and they might not understand what your experiences are. And another person I talked to, she shared a story of how she met a mother and a daughter, and the daughter talked about how she didn't know how to explain depression to her mom, but then one day she sort of thought of explaining it as saying, I feel like an angel that's been broken, to her mom. And afterwards, her mom started to really understand what she needed, and this sort of language really broke that barrier of those differences. And I think this really highlights that in the end, a lot of the times, like people, parents and their kids, they all have the best intentions, but among the conflict and the communication, how can you connect back? And sometimes it's easy to overlook that cultural and generational gap and to feel that the situation is impossible, but sometimes accessing each other can mean something like developing the language to be able to communicate to each other. So this is the next piece, which is on sort of like that professional level. Sometimes in my research, one point that I encountered was that in the sort of mental health systems we have and the research on psychiatry and psychology that exists, a lot of it has been done on a pretty specific demographic. And that demographic might be the white, college-educated, middle class of American people. And sort of the definitions that we have as psychological behaviors, sometimes they're defined universally when they might vary culturally. And when it comes to mental health, one researcher I talked to, she described how there was research done at the South Cove Community Health Center, which is a health center for the Asian American population in Boston, specifically Asian immigrants. It's a health center, so people can come to it for their physical health needs as well as their mental health needs. She described how there's a research done on like this thing called the PHQ-9, which is a depression screening method. You just sort of answer questions based on symptoms of depression to see whether you might have depression or not, and it was tested to see how effective this was among Asian populations specifically. So I started taking like this universal standard and applying it within a more specific community to see how effective it is. And the reason why this research was important was because sometimes people might express their depression and their symptoms differently. In fact, there's research that people in Chinese psychiatry, how people might express their symptoms more somatically, meaning as physical symptoms, rather than saying things that are more like related to emotions, and how both of them related to being depression, but they are expressed differently. So it's important to be able to recognize those different expressions of what depression is. So at the culmination of sort of everything I did for my research project, I realized that the point that I'd like to make is that in the end I know that I can't change the expertise. I'm just a high school student, and I have no intention of sort of changing like the facts and like what is true or not true about mental health and race. And it is a sensitive topic, and it's something that's difficult to talk about. But at the end of it all, I think something that was really important was to talk about how to open up those conversations and make them more accessible to all people. And there's sort of two insights that I got from people, and two sort of like things that I heard a lot. One piece was this idea of curiosity. And sort of in our conversations, what role can genuine curiosity in those persons' experiences play? And I think sometimes with mental health, oftentimes when people reach out for support, it's a feeling of alarm, like, what can I do for you? How can I help you fix your problems? But this mindset may sometimes be unhelpful, because in the end, the person is the owner of their own experiences, and they really need to be given a space to figure it out for themselves. So rather than the expertise side, you don't need to tell someone who's reaching out to you what they need. Rather, you just need to really care about their experiences and ask them these open questions that allow it to identify what is important to them for themselves. And both of you guys can have open dialogue that way. Another piece of advice, this is something that Mr. Cardona, who is the medical counselor here in North, said to me. He said, I've let go of things being good or bad, and I only define them as being problematic or preferred. And what does this mean? I think the idea of things being good or bad is that oftentimes when things fall along cultural lines, they fall along lines of people having different experiences. It's easy to see things as black or white, what is good or bad, and it's easy to accidentally impose our own judgments onto other people's experiences. But the idea of seeing them as, is this a problem for you or is it not a problem for you? What are some solutions? What has helped you? That challenges people to think more critically and more openly, and to really spark a dialogue about what has been impacting them. So that was my PRAPS presentation, and I encourage you to look at my website, where I have more student experiences and more teacher and counselor statements. And thank you today.